Thank you everybody for joining us for this session about the experience of platform work. Thank you especially to those who joined us from very far. This is a 3-paper session, so we have time for presentation and discussion, up to 18 minutes for presentation and 10 minutes question. We'll follow the order of the program. So the first presenter is Timothy Charlton-Czaplicki from Copenhagen Business School, right?
Exactly.
You have the floor.
Okay, perfect. So I think it's all set up, and I think you can see the screen remotely and locally. So I'm just going to get started. Thank you to the conveners, for the great opportunity to speak to a room of experts about this study we've been working on. Philip is presenting elsewhere today, so he can't make it. So I'm presenting for the both of us. My name is Timothy Charlton. I'm a PhD fellow at CBS, Department of Digitalization, and I focus on the experience of platform work, and I have multiple different sort of studies I work on, and this particular one is about the lived experience of platform work, or what we try to analyze as the lived experience of platform work. And to shortly summarize what we're trying to do is essentially I'm presenting the findings from a social sequence analysis of a household panel study of the UK. And we aim to better describe the size, relevance, and composition of experiences in the UK gig economy. And so what Philip and I are trying to demonstrate, hopefully with some success, is the necessity to capture more than just a momentary snapshot of the gig economy. I.e., once a worker logs on to a platform once, they are grouped as platform workers and gig workers and captured in sort of single wave convenience samples, and basically inflate the categories we use, meaning we are having a harder time to understand what it actually means for the lives of the people working in this kind of work arrangement. And we see this research as sort of an initial indication that slots into lots of existing great research, qualitative and quantitative, and will sort of hopefully give us a bit of a more fine-grained vocabulary to speak about the experience of working in the gig economy, something that can be expanded in the future or not, something maybe we can discuss after the presentation. So, all right. So just very briefly to provide some framing for this research, the literature on platform work has moved in certain cycles, passing through narratives of sort of liberation from geographies of labor, through providing flexibility, meaning essentially liberation from the temporality of labor, towards conceptions of algorithmic control, surveillance, and exploitation. And peripherally to all this, there are discussions about the kind of skills that we require and gain through platform work, and other aspects that might have some relevance for society. And what pervades these debates is a sort of a loose consensus that digital platforms provide at least a future of work, among others, a reality and a future. The verdict is still out on what the scale and quality of this future might be, but I think the consensus is generally there. We've moved beyond the stage where we would say that it is the future of work. I don't think that's really reflected in the literature anymore. That sort of imaginary where we all got subsumed into some kind of huge social human computing machine, I think that's not the current state of the debate, but a future it probably is. So what we're trying to say is we're trying to focus on the who aspect of platform work. Who are the people that work in the UK gig economy? We want to take account of their biographies rather than ascribing certain qualities to them based solely on sort of membership in that gig economy group. So the challenge was to find a perspective that would respect the individual experiences while also yielding some kind of generalizable insight. We ended up splitting the research into two questions. Essentially, one, how many gig workers are there in the UK? I'm going to address that in a minute, why that question is important. And then also, what are the typical career trajectories leading up to participation in the UK gig economy? So basically, how do people enter this kind of work? And there's also a reason why we weren't focusing on how people leave it, which is something hopefully in the future we can look at, but not today. So let me just briefly explain what the sort of the analytical underpinning is that we chose. We have a sort of a dual problematization. As mentioned, platforms represent a future of work, and but the tools that we have to look under the hood of sort of this sort of big tent concept gig economy are often a bit limited. So based on the literature we reviewed, we identified a lack of methodological diversity in studying the gig economy, an over-reliance on convenience samples in survey research, a lot of qualitative research, but which is of course very focused on sort of small, isolated or insular experiences. And we began assembling sort of a common overview of frequently cited reports. And it's in the paper, there's sort of a table, which are mostly sort of grey literature, which are sort of EU and UN-funded studies, which are often then repeated in peer-reviewed research, which, as we show, sort of provide an overestimation of how big this phenomenon actually is. And just to sort of give it some framing, we're also trying to take out some of the maybe sort of urgency that the early literature on the gig economy had. And then the second problem we identified is that there is a kind of temporal dissonance or a mismatch between how we understand the gig and platform economy and how we measure it. So we already know essentially that platform work is almost never a permanent state. So there are very few sort of professional career gig economy workers. Instead, workers traverse platforms in multiple stages of their lives. Rather than sort of treating them as a drop-in replacement for conventional employers, they're finding new ways to sort of arrange around this phenomenon. So how can we gain a longitudinal, inherently individual and unique worker-centric account of gig economy careers? We try to approach the problem through a life course perspective. I won't go into too much detail about this, but essentially the life course perspective mandates looking at various aspects of individuals' lives, including their agency, i.e. their ability to shape their life trajectories, their embeddedness in social systems, sometimes described as linked lives, but essentially how they relate to other individuals around them, the wider societal and institutional context of their existence, and the temporality of their activity on the micro level, but also in regard to historical events and major life transitions. So what might a historical event be? Major platform legislation that's passed on the state level or the national level, which might in some way impact their experience. So where did we turn to find data that was rich enough to support such a perspective? We analyze a UK household longitudinal study, the UK HLS. It's a representative panel study of the UK population administered by the University of Essex, covers all 4 UK countries. It's in theory linkable to further sort of biological or administrative data which are available, which obviously would require certain levels of clearance and permission. And it's generally considered to be quite a sound, representative, multi-year panel study. It's essentially a continuation of the British household panel study with a carryover, about 8,000 participants, I believe. So in some cases, you can link back up to 20 years. But, well, in this case, we focused only on the recent UK HLS, and that has now 11 years of data. I think the 12th year will be published around November. So what makes this data source interesting in this context, and as far as I know, unique among panel studies, is that they started querying individuals on whether they participated in the gig economy. So the precise wording used by the interviewers is, I think, in the last month have you done any of the following activities in order to make money using a website, platform, or app? And then they link, or automatically by default, this information is linked with a lot of demographic and contextual information that is contained in this survey in any case. So, yeah, and also it's about 40,000 households. It's a substantial study. Briefly, before taking a more individual perspective, what does an analysis of the weighted survey means reveal about the composition of the UK gig economy? So we found that around 1.4% of the UK population, or roughly then about 930,000, between 850,000 and 1 million individuals, claimed that they had participated in some kind of work within the last month of this interview in 2020. It was mostly men. Demographically, the mean age of this subpopulation is around 10 years below the national average, and a high percentage, relatively high percentage of workers in this group, or of individuals in this group, were foreign-born. There are more granular sort of measures of migration patterns and mobility patterns in this survey, but we haven't gotten around to analyzing them yet. So we just basically took the overt question, were you born abroad? Yes, no. So that's about 20%. Previously, I said about how we need to adopt more individual-centric perspectives and move away from this sort of big tent understanding. So why is it necessary to look at these means in the first place? It's to relate them, to our analysis of the occupational sequences, which I'll show in just a moment, and also to those frequently cited gig economy metrics that I mentioned before. Because from the sort of analysis of those that we did, and we looked about 8 studies, I think, they suggest that around 3.5 to 10% of individuals in the UK have somehow traversed the gig economy, which, even though they might not be directly comparable, these measures, seems like a general overestimation of the impact of the phenomenon as such. Also, because it might be of interest to some, this particular study, the UK HLS, differentiates between courier services, food delivery, manual labor performed or facilitated through a platform, mobility services, such as taxi services, and online or remote kinds of platform work. And then obviously the not in the gig economy separate group which exists. Of these, manual tasks and online platform works were the most frequently performed gig economy work, followed by mobility and food delivery, and courier services was a sort of a small group because it doesn't really fit the concept very well and might have been conflated with food delivery. So, yeah, to give you 2 examples of these studies that we looked at, one is the FEP study, the other the Colim study. These are actually at least partly longitudinal, or at least repeated measures, although I think the Colim study draws on the same set of participants. And they're both cited quite frequently, over 250 citations each. And they indicate a much larger percentage, and it's quite often then sort of cited in introductions saying, it's a huge phenomenon, there are 5% or 10% even of the UK population engaging in the gig economy. Probably not the case, although obviously the caveat is they all use slightly different wording. Some try to sort of capture whoever participated in the gig economy. Some give a more granular in the last 3 months, etc. So I think the idea is we're not trying to do a meta-analysis, and working in the gig economy is still a reality for almost 1 million individuals in the UK. So it is a major aspect of work and what it's becoming, but it might not be the dramatical, all-encompassing phenomenon that it was made out to be, at least at the beginning. All right, so to the next step of our analysis, this was social sequence analysis. Just a few brief notes on our method. We conceptualized career paths as the sequence of occupational states an individual passes through in their work life courses. So, for example, leaving school, getting a first job, having a job, being unemployed, etc. And in the UK HLS, we have 11 years of this information leading up to the moment when someone claimed they participated in the gig economy in some form or another. So the obvious limitation here is that we only have one observation for this person, this individual being in the gig economy. With future waves emerging, we will know more about, was this a one-off occurrence? Did people stay in this kind of work, or did they leave it again? At this point, we don't know this. We only know what they were doing in the years leading up to this point. We then coded these states individual for each sequence of each worker, and we calculated the distance between individual sequences based on their substitution costs. So this methodology is quite well documented in the literature. Essentially, how many individual states would need to be replaced to turn one sequence of occupational states into another sequence of occupational states. So substituting different states incurs different costs. So going from employed to unemployed, it would incur a different cost than going from self-employed to retired. Or substituting entering the labor market for retired is not possible because you can't enter the labor market and retire immediately. These sort of things are have to be decided on, and we did, and we documented that, and happy to speak about that later, but maybe not right now. Finally, we then use cluster analysis using both Ward's method and partitioning around medioids to arrive at 6 distinct clusters of occupational sequences that workers have. And then we performed a chi-square contingency table test with the type of gig economy work performed and the occupational sequence leading up to performing this kind of work. And yes, I mean, the test was significant, which is somewhat intuitive because retirees might be less likely to work as food delivery drivers than labor market entrants. Okay, so these are the results. These are the chronograms. We can look at them in more detail, but just in the spirit of not taking too long, I'm just going to move on to the interpretation slide. So these are the 6 groups we found. The first, labor market entrants, young individuals, whose activity or occupational sequence was characterized by a major life transition, so going from not working to working. And around a quarter of all UK gig workers fall into this cluster, and unsurprising in itself because the gig economy is comparatively younger than the average population, and they mostly work on these manual gig work platforms. Think TaskRabbit, and the second most prevalent group was remote online work. The steadily employed cluster invites a bit more speculation. So it's the largest group of gig economy workers, I think almost 33%. And these are individuals who were not labor market entrants and whose previous work-life courses, so the 11 years leading up to this point, were characterized by steady states of employment. So the question is, almost 1/3 of this group worked in remote types of gig work. So think Upwork or Fiverr. So the question is, are they in fact substituting some of their income using remote platform work? Are they? I mean, it's definitely a cluster which has been hypothesized to exist and which has been shown to exist based on previous studies, that people are sort of adding to their income using the gig economy, and it might be a cause of concern in terms of precarious working conditions. The steadily self-employed, characterized by unbroken sequences of self-employment, is together with the recently self-employed group, they make up about 40% of the entire sample of gig economy workers. And again, this raises some interesting questions about self-identification. Do gig economy workers consider their work as self-employment? Do they perceive themselves to be entrepreneurs? So possibly a group worth inquiring more about. And the final 2 categories, re-entries and retirees also raise interesting questions. So why and how are platforms used by retirees? Possible at-risk demographic or demographic at risk of precarity that's off the radar today, but we can now link their experience to other demographic variables we have available. And the re-entries are essentially individuals who've left the labor market, say, to perform childcare, and then re-entered it. And also potentially interesting to analyze the role of platforms in enabling this transition back into the labor market. Yeah, so briefly to summarize platform careers, this is where we're still very much still a work in progress. We were trying to sort of conceptualize this idea of workers being carried into the gig economy on diverse trajectories. What do we mean with worker-centric? So even these sort of old career path models that we have at our availability, including flexible careers, are still to a certain extent employer-centric. So workers rely on the reputation of their employers to sort of transition from one stage to another, whereas in the gig economy, there's a lot of self-management going on in terms of reputation and sort of transferring from one stage to another. And as future waves of this survey become available, hopefully we can study things such as senescence in the gig economy. So people aging with their platform work is something that hopefully will become available to us. And yeah, so that's, I've just sort of summarized it here. And thank you very much. I think that was 20 minutes.
Yes, first question.
I love your paper, and I love your paper because I have been using sequence analysis to analyze venture creating processes. So my questions are motivated by the methodological struggle that come with this, and afterwards the struggle of publishing it because very few people know sequence analysis, which sometimes difficult for the reviewers. But my questions are, first of all, most gig work is done part-time or is done just as a side. So would you not need to run multi-channel analysis to capture this? And how have you dealt with several activities at the same time? And the second one comes back to what kind of states did you really have? Because with cluster analysis, we'll always find something, and then it depends very much on what measures you need to define the right number of clusters and hence the different sequences. And they depend very strongly on the core states that we use because they drive the core clusters that we will identify. So I think the question is, what kind of states did we have? And yeah, to what extent do you really see shifts between clusters or just mono states events or states because of how you coded it or how the states did?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned a couple of points which are obviously quite relevant, and I do want to say there is a big caveat. So around all this research, also because we only have one observation of being in the gig economy. So we acknowledge that, and the idea behind it is to simply try and introduce some maybe methodological diversity into looking at this phenomenon, which has been studied from this similar perspectives often. And we were trying to gain another perspective on this phenomenon that maybe we haven't had before. In terms of multi-channel analysis, absolutely, that was the plan. We haven't gotten around to it yet. As I said, it's a work in progress. Actually, this data set is ideally suited because we do have mobility patterns, we have household composition, we have various other sort of longitudinal variables which we might include or might not include. However, as you said, with clustering, we always find a solution of sorts. It's the more channels we introduce, the more fine-grained and less meaningful categories or subcategories we will probably find. I've started trying to do it and it wasn't very fruitful. And I think we did some robustness and validity checks on the clustering solution. We have essentially, as you said, so the occupational states are basically the ones that they use for the survey. It's 5, I think I can show you later if you want, but I can't remember right now but instead of the standard out of the labor market, retired, unemployed, self-employed, partly self-employed, and occupied, occupation, full-time. And there's also a full-time, part-time variable, which we wanted to look at. And then the 3 of those were quite stable, as in they were characterized by simply one state, whereas 3 others were characterized by a transition. And I think that might be interesting because it might be worth looking at how does the transition from A to B actually relate to taking up platform. Thank you.
Next question by Alex and then Stephen.
Hi, Timothy, great to see you. And it's also great to see we're using these questions. Me and Billy inputted into the writing of them as well, so it's good to see them being used. One thing, because I've been using, or I'm interested in understanding society in order to add weight to my own data, my own survey, and something which is interesting is that domestic work is one of the biggest categories. It's about 1/3 of all the work, which I was very surprised about, because when you try and then research or access kind of domestic workers, cleaners, or handy, like TaskRabbit workers, handy people, they're quite hard to access. And so I was wondering whether this is, if there is, I agree this is the best sample there is of gig workers available, but whether this might be a sampling bias because you're knocking on people's houses, you're more likely to get those types of workers. Or if there's anything in your analysis or when you add weights, which kind of explains this or reduces the prevalence of domestic work. Is this something that you've noticed in the data?
Well, I mean, first of all, I was really happy to see that they had taken up these questions. It makes sense that you asked for them to be included, and I don't understand why they're not included in more. For example, the German longitudinal study would be an easy win to gain access to what is clearly quite a substantial part of society, which otherwise we just don't really know much about. Or we assume many things about, but we don't. We're not able to substantiate them. And in terms of the, it would be interesting to take a look at the weights and whether that particular subgroup of domestic sort of manual type work receives a boost through the weighting process. But yeah, worth checking out, and I'll have a look because that might be a potential bias. People going around, and yeah, I'll take a look. Thanks.
Stephen?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So Timothy, many thanks for a very interesting presentation. In the literature, there has been an effort to characterize the heterogeneity of the platform workforce, and you, as you suggested, have provided a much more fine-grained analysis of the ways in which the platform workforce is differentiated. And I noticed, though, when you presented the 6 types, 2 of them stand out to me as distinct from the others. And this is kind of, I suppose, prefiguring some of the discussion that we'll have in my paper and also the paper on segmentation processes. I'm thinking about the steadily employed and the steadily self-employed. By my arithmetic, it suggests that they alone account for 3/4 of the platform workers in your study. So I'm wondering, I wonder if you have any, if you might speculate a bit about how those groups, which seem more firmly anchored in the platform economy, might have different orientations or worldviews than people who are more contingently invested in the platform workforce. So I'm wondering if you thought about that or if you have any data about that.
Yeah, I mean, excellent point. And it's, again, something I hope to look into because it is a massive survey. It has a whole plethora of variables they capture and sometimes infer based on other questions and other variables of data. And I don't think they make up quite 3/4. I can look it up, but it's substantial. And obviously the assumption is that some people have worked in the gig economy before, might not have characterized it as work. So they might say, look, I'm steadily self-employed, but actually they were already performing platform work either wholly or partially as part of their occupation. And the same might go for the full-time. I mean, we can assume that some people consider themselves full-time employed, even though they I mean, maybe not. But that's a more unlikely explanation. But in principle, it's further work to be done to look at other variables to try and understand a bit more about what these demographics look like and what might differentiate them from their peers who are not in the gig economy, because we can do that comparison.
And we can have one last question by Valeria. Very short, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I just have, in fact, a very short question. On the youth categories, did you find also evidence of students? Because if I understood well, you kind of define people who are entering the labor market, but you really seem to refer to people who are entering the labor market as kind of employees or looking for employment. Did you find also evidence of just students that they use this kind of or they do jobs on platforms, as it seems that this also is an interesting category, at least, which comes in Europe in some of the studies also we have been doing in Belgium, for example, and in other countries. And this morning I was listening to a presentation in Denmark, and it seems that also there is a lot of student workforce in this platform. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. There is definitely, they are sort of folded into that category. And there are extra variables available again, which we just haven't linked to this, but we should be able to sort of split up between people in education or who've been in education in, let's say, the last 2 years around this state, and individuals who haven't been in full-time education. The majority would be in education, and they would be performing this simultaneously to their education. Definitely.
Thank you very much. So our next presenter is Stephen Vallas from Boston University. We see your presentation. You have the floor.
So you see the title of our paper, Coming to Terms with Platform Labor. It's a co-authored paper. Julie Chris Terrell, a PhD student about to finish up at Northeastern University, and myself have been the authors. And as you see at the bottom, this is a study that has been supported by the National Science Foundation in the US. And what we're trying to do is to understand basically what work is like when it's the algorithm that takes responsibility for managing your labor. So, I'll give an outline of the talk first. We want to situate the study in the larger literature, debate over platform work. To give you a sense as to where we're going, as the title suggests, we're foregrounding what we believe is an aspect of platform work and the work experience of gig workers that hasn't received the attention that it warrants, and that is their orientations toward the risks that they face as they perform their gig, other tasks. We'll briefly discuss the methods that we've used, which I fear have committed some of the fallacies or the limitations that Timothy just briefly reviewed. It is a multi-platform study that's based on interview data. So there's no mixed method analysis, it's entirely qualitative, but a multi-platform approach. So we'll work through the findings. The meat of the paper is in the findings that emerge from our interviews. So we begin by talking about the various types of risk that platform workers experience as they go about in earning the income that gig work provides or doesn't provide. But what we're really interested in is the orientations toward risk that gig workers exhibit. How to capture their different views, reactions, and feelings about the risks, and feelings of fairness about shouldering such risks and the severity of those risks. So we have worked by developing a typology of workers' orientations toward risk by situating their views on a continuum, as I will explain in a moment. The overall pattern that we find is encapsulated in the concept of platform exceptionalism. In other words, the idea that and this is what we mean by the normalization of gig work, which seems to suggest that workers see gig work as different, as not allowing workers to engage in the kinds of claims making that conventional wage labor would support. And at the very end of our paper, we try to explain why this view has engulfed so many, a majority of the workers in our sample. In other words, we try to explain this normalization effect. And then we'll close with some brief implications of our study and also the suggested future lines of analysis. So first, the debate over platform work, thinking about social scientific studies, leaving aside those who advocated for its the wonders of flexibility. In the beginning of the first wave of research in the kind of, say, 2016, 2017, began to emphasize two major three themes. One was focused particularly on algorithms and their affordances, and the other on the precarious nature of gig work. So as is familiar to everyone here, the first approach, stressing out what was sometimes called algorithmic despotism in some studies, emphasized the ways in which digital technology deepened the dependence of labor on capital. And you see here a couple of the themes that fostered this effect in the minds of early analysts. A second theme emphasized more precarity, and the emphasis here was on the reclassification or misclassification of workers and not the movement from wage labor to payment by the task. The notion here is that platform work accelerates or intensifies an already existing trend toward the precarization of labor, denying workers legal protections, and even the ability to engage in collective action in many societies. But on the heels of this first approach, there began to be a greater recognition of many of the themes that Timothy and his co-authors have emphasized, and that is acknowledgement of the salient divisions among the gig workforce. In other words, the difficulties that emerge in trying to speak or to characterize the gig workforce with any uniform generalizations. So heterogeneity of the gig workforce often was conceived in terms of a time commitment, full-time, part-time, or economic dependence. In other words, whether the wage or earnings entirely depend on gig work. A second feature in this later stage of research on gig work have pointed out that affordances are not all determining. The algorithms can be defeated, they can be subverted, workers can evade controls, they can learn which metrics they can gain, and they can engage in collective action as well. So movement away from hyperdeterminism or movement away from kind of technological fixation. But the current state of play as we see it has retained an emphasis upon platforms as highly coercive mechanisms of labor control. Now, so the assumption bound up here, and not entirely an illegitimate one, is that the assumption is that gig workers view the imposition of risks on them as unfair, as illegitimate. So there's a kind of resentment or a chafing at the kind of redistribution of risks toward labor. And yet, surveys, when they are done and capture attitudes, often suggest that workers prefer independent contractor status, which we feel develops something of a paradox. And that is, why would workers prefer a legal status that exposes them to the very risks that they are assumed to resent? So the fact that obvious answers might be, well, workers value flexibility, begin to kind of suggest a simple instrumental or a transactional logic suggest to us that there's an insufficient understanding of the cultural logics that workers do in fact invoke when it comes to the management or the experience of risk, the encountering of the risks that their jobs provoke. So what we're trying to do is to foreground the risks and how workers feel about them, with their risk orientations, which we believe underlie their preferences regarding legal status. The research question that our analysis poses is, how do workers perceive the risks they confront, and which orientations seem to predominate and why? And that basically is the thrust of our analysis. So our methods, we use targeted Facebook ads and social media to recruit participants. This is an analysis has begun to gain some traction in the literature. And allegedly, the use of such methods is at least equivalent to the use of random digit dialing as is traditionally used in surveys. So by using ads and kind of putting ads before people and asking to click on to a site where we can contact them. We've managed to conduct interviews which are taped and transcribed with 70 workers in the types of the sectors of the gig economy that you see: ride hail, grocery delivery, and food courier. The timing is important here in that our data were collected during the early wave of the pandemic from late spring of 2020 to May 2021, over a period of almost about 11 months. All workers were active on the sites, and they had to complete at least 30 tasks or jobs in order to be included in our survey. So there was some variation in terms of some people were quite senior and long time invested in platforms. Others were much more newcomers. So the platforms you see that we focused on, a little bit of the demographics of the sample, reflecting our Boston focus, Boston metropolitan area, I should mention. The participants, the sample was evenly split by gender, reflecting the kind of New England demographic composition. 85% were white. Also perhaps reflecting the timing of the study. Gig work was the sole income source for half of the people. Many people resorted to gig work because their jobs had evaporated during the pandemic. And it was a relatively educated sample. Some people had graduate degrees, many had college degrees, and only a third had only high school degrees. So there are some limitations here. There's the survivor bias issue that a large proportion of people move onto the platform, onto the sites, and then quickly abandon them. And also the Boston focus, not entirely clear whether the relatively generous welfare state provisions that Massachusetts provides allow us to generalize to broader other cities, and also the pandemic context. These are all limitations of our study. So with the data in hand transcribed, the way that we coded the data was iteratively. We began by identifying the most salient risks that workers encountered, and then exploring how they spoke about them, what feelings emerged, feelings of unfairness, feelings of frustration, feelings of anger. And we began with a simple continuum that stretched from consent at one end to contestation at the other. And then we began to classify workers in a somewhat more detailed way, and eventually yielding a five-fold typology of risk orientations. And then because we had a fair number of interviews, we were able to statistically correlate these types with different socioeconomic conditions and the structure of gig work itself as best as we could. The risks that emerged as most salient in our study, in some ways varied, of course, across the different types of platforms. And in other cases, there were commonalities that reached across all of the sectors. So there were differences between the platforms in terms of many of the physical risks that were obviously more salient to be expected in ride hail because there's more interaction with the customer in a direct and co-present way. Assaults, drunkenness, drunken behavior, vomiting in cars, having to be lifted back up to one's home, fear of COVID and exposure to COVID. These were most salient in ride hail and not in simple food or grocery delivery. One thing that's important also as a source of variation is that there was marked differentiation by, there was volatility in all of the platforms that we studied, but the markets showed some commonalities. Ride hail just completely, the bottom dropped out of demand, a demand for ride hail at the height of the pandemic. And we could see that. And we could see many people bailing out to become couriers, food or grocery delivery people. But then what happened was that because of this oversupply of labor, there was a depletion of income earning opportunities that moving from an initial lucrative status to a much more difficult income earning situation. So some variation over time and across platforms that we found notable. But the similarities were fairly pronounced as well. Some of them were familiar in literature. There were financial risks of people buying automobiles only to have ride hail become unsupportable. This chronic oversupply of labor toward which platforms generally moved, unpredictable and insecure earnings, arbitrary deactivation, and frequent change in compensation systems and algorithmic controls. These were all risks that people spoke about. The physical risks sometimes food couriers or grocery couriers lifting very, very heavy boxes of water up multiple steps, accidents in traffic, having to serve unsafe areas, and things of these sorts. Legal risks were also pronounced. Parking violations, traffic rules and tickets, and also the illegal behavior of customers. And we'll speak more about customers' behavior in a bit. But when ride-hail drivers, for example, have to serve infant mothers or families with infants without a car seat, or when people are overpopulating a car, puts drivers at risk of either deactivation or risks and liability along those lines. So most of these risks have found some expression in the literature. Others that emerged in our interviews were less familiar and less well known in the literature, and particularly harassment and abuse by customers as a very salient feature of the risks that people, kind of interactional risks that sometimes could be quite traumatic, but also status threats. A number of the people in our sample, not a huge proportion, but enough to kind of wonder whether this warrants more study, spoke of the stigma of gig work. In other words, keeping their ride hailing a secret from family and friends, or feeling that clients should not know about what they're doing because it might in fact undermine the perceived professional or status credentials that they might otherwise claim. In order to sort people into specific types, so we can understand their responses to risk, we focused in particularly on 3 dimensions, and I have them in the bulleted points here. One was the perceived severity of the risks that they encountered. The second was the sense of agency or personal efficacy in the work that they felt about whether they were in control. And the third is the moral vocabulary that workers used. In these terms, looking at the ways in which these dimensions were manifested in the data led us to identify 5 distinct types. So moving from the ends of the continuum, we saw people who embraced the risks with enthusiasm, and I'll explain and give a couple of examples of each of these types. And at the opposite end, people who opposed or contested the imposition of risks on workers, either by advocating strikes or collective action or legal intervention, or actually engaging in those things. But in between these 2 ends, as I'll explain, there were people who accepted the risks willingly, but with less of a kind of an exuberant embrace of them. People who complied, but instrumentalized their views. In other words, they suspended moral judgment and just looked in a transactional way at their gig work. And those who also submitted to the risks, but reluctantly, out of resignation, because they felt they couldn't fight City Hall, as the phrase was sometimes used. This is a table which is probably unreadable, but nonetheless captures the 3 dimensions and the ways in which they factored into our typology. And a little bit, I'll talk a little bit on the right about the proportions that each the sample was composed of. But let me give examples of each of them, and we can return to this table if there are questions. So the first and most enthusiastic, 2 examples of this embracing risk orientation. Having felt the freedom of having your own business, I would definitely like to incorporate having my own thing. Would I consider buying 5 Uber cars and having people drive for me? Yeah, I would, because I've been so successful at it. And I'd want to give someone else the opportunity, like, yeah, you want to borrow my Prius for $200 a week? You'll make $1,800. Go for it. Now, that's interesting because there's an imaginary conversation with others. He's imputing an entrepreneurial ethos to others. So he's deeply, Andrew is deeply embedded in such a view. And a second equally interesting case was that of Louise, an Instacart shopper, who said, I think I'm going to probably expand, where I might need to hire 1 or 2 people so I can see it growing. I've advertised, I've done some stuff, I'm constantly marketing. So Louise had participated in a separate site called Dumpling, which fosters a personal shopper who has clientele of their own. Louise was actually shopping for Instacart in order to develop her own clientele. So these are people that fit the notion of the entrepreneurial subject very, very, very well. And at the opposite extent, our end of the continuum are people who are much more resistant, as we'll see. But let's work in terms of from the most consensual toward the opposite end. The second group, which was more enthusiastic, accepting risk. I'm sure some people, very interesting here. I'm sure some people could say that driving to random houses is potentially unsafe, but I've never really felt it that way. So there's a notion of threats. I just don't really worry about it too much or keep it at the front of my mind. So there's kind of management of awareness going on here. Usually I just I click accept without looking. But the second one, Chelsea, very similar. Yeah, I mean, there's some periods, like I've said, that I've gone into a few, well, maybe only one or two restaurants where I felt uncomfortable in some areas, but you just work through it. I work on the problem of ignoring it. So there's a kind of a learned inattention to the risks in this case, the second type. Third type, I mentioned the kind of transactional approach to risk. Mikhail, who's a Russian immigrant, was asked about the lack of benefits or career advancement in gig work. And he said, yeah, gig work is kind of different. But obviously any profession or any gig or any job has advantages and disadvantages. So it's fine. So there's kind of a balancing of costs and benefits, kind of a logic going on here we see with Heidi. You don't know what you're going to make or when you're going to make it, but I don't think minimum wage would be good because I think that, I mean, some days it would be good, but some days you're making way more than minimum wage. So I guess you just take the good with the bad. So there's a kind of an instrumental transactional approach here, suspending moral judgment in the end, and to think about the deal that is the best that you can get. And then a fourth type, those who show some resigned submission. Why should I have to pay for my own personal protective equipment to go shopping for your people? And you're telling me, as if she's speaking to the app, to the companies, and you're telling me you're not going to reimburse me? That's not how it works. I know for a fact that you're supposed to be giving us these supplies. Walmart and all the other grocery stores, they're supplying their workers with masks. We should be under the same thing. We're not part of a union. We don't get extra kickbacks. We don't get hazard pay. Instacart is making a fortune right now. So the fact that they're paying so little really is a little disgusting. But I wish it was more, but hey, what are you going to do? So there's a kind of a moral critique that's developed, but ultimately is a shrugging of one's shoulders and a submission that we see as a fourth type. And then the fifth and most resistant or oppositional type was those composed of those who contested risk. Said Peter, an Uber driver, I subsidize Uber with my labor and give them money. In other words, that money is rolling in the wrong direction. Or Robert, also a ride-hail driver, the money was good at first, but they basically sold us a lie, and that lie is now sticking with us. And until we defeat them in court, we're not going to have any success and any real happiness. I should mention that people who were oppositional oftentimes engaged in litigation, sometimes wrote drivers' bills of rights, and were engaged in national different worker support groups. So it was not merely a verbal kind of opposition. So now, at this point in our analysis, what we were led to conclude was two things, really. The first is the evidence, again, of pronounced heterogeneity and risk orientations. And what's striking here is that the two polar ends of the continuum, embracers and opposers, account for only a little bit more than a fifth of the sample. So those views that loom largest, either indirectly or implicitly or explicitly in the literature, actually account for only 1/5 of the people that emerged in our study. Most orientations, in other words, lie in between, and they embody complexities that the literature has not sufficiently engaged, it seems to us. In other words, simple pro-con portrayals grossly distort workers' views. There's a complexity there that we need to unpack. The second point is that relatively, if we look back at the chart, you would see that relatively few workers exhibit counter-hegemonic views of risk imposition. In other words, it's the embracers, it's those who acquiesce, those who are acceptors, that really predominate in the sample. And which, another way of putting that is that most workers have normalized the risks of gig work. And again, the concept that I introduced before, they exhibit platform exceptionalism, the assumption that gig workers cannot legitimately claim the rights that conventional employment offers. And these are the views that predominate. And the question then is why? So Obviously there is the ideological predominance of business organizations and the very effective advertising campaigns and the neoliberal context in which people labor. These are obviously background, very distant kind of forces that cannot be ignored. But beyond that, we see three factors that work to foster normalization. I'll quickly review them and then wrap up. So one is workers' distance from necessity. Another is the possession of buffers, economic buffers. A second one is a sense of autonomy that is fostered by gig work and piece rate payment. And the third is the prominent role of the customer within the service triangle. So the first of these three is really embedded in the labor market and the class structure more generally. And the latter two are actually fostered by the algorithms and the design, the affordances of the design of the apps themselves. So to begin with distance from necessity, we found that normalization was statistically greater among workers who possessed an economic buffer. We used two measures here. One was access to savings of $1,000 or more. In other words, the ability to withstand an emergency of that sort without distress. And the second was perceived financial security rated on a 1 to 10 scale. The tendency to normalize gig work was greater among people who had more advantageous, had buffers of this sort. So what we conclude from that is that platforms are able to capitalize on the stability that other firms provide. These are people that are sufficiently protected or anchored in the literature. The analogy that I've sometimes used is that much in the way that employers in the late 19th century were able to hire single female workers who were subsidized by living at home. There was a free riding nature to that behavior. There's a similar kind of capitalizing of free riding behavior that apps are able to do, and that minimizes their exposure to resistance from below. But a second factor had to do with the relative autonomy of gig work. This is something that Julie has written about. It's something that we've emphasized in our annual review article. And that is that although there may be a kind of all manner of constraints that are imposed on gig workers, the work itself is relatively unscripted, and there are constant choices that gig workers have to invoke or make, which jobs to accept, where and when to log on, which metrics they can ignore, which they can't, what income strategy to use, how to interact with customers. The notion here is that by delegating control to workers, as they begin to develop sophistication, they derive a sense of personal efficacy in the work, and this tends to give them a sense that they're in control of their own labor. It tends to obscure the power of capital and the extraction of value from their labor in ways that remind us of the famous analysis of Michael Burroboy in Manufacturing Consent, and more recently, Kathleen Reisbach et al. In their analysis of Instacart. That kind of consensual nature that's built into the conduct of the work itself. The third point we think has probably received the least of the attention in the analysis in the literature, and has to do with the role of the customer in what is in fact a service triad, the service triangle that Robin Leidner spoke about 3 decades ago. What emerged in our interviews were just a wealth of stories about abusive customers that dwarfed parallel accounts of apps. People were much more likely to focus their ire on the customers who stiffed them on Christmas Eve, or who engaged in bait and switch by promising a tip that then disappeared, or who engaged in fraud against them, claiming food was not delivered when in fact it was. Free riding behavior from the customer looms large, in other words. Now, that's understandable given the immediacy of the customer as kind of a physical or a living presence in the service triangle. But the effect is one that led workers to fixate on unjust treatment by customers in ways that seemed to push into the background the extraction of value by the apps, and indeed the prioritization that the apps place on background checks for the workers, but not controls or terms of service that are obligatory and imposed on customers. So again, it's the kind of emphasis of the customer that obscures deeper inequalities. So these are the factors that we believe foster the normalization of gig work. And now we are mindful of the limitations that we've suggested before. One, again, is the survivor bias. We've mainly focused on people who've been cited. This is again the problem with the snapshot that Timothy was talking about, and also the case of Boston as a potential limit to our study. But what we find is that platform labor does fragment its workforce in very far-reaching ways, and that limits likely support for mobilization. So that suggests that protracted struggles in the United States, at least, are likely. But there are some cracks that we see in the normalization edifice. One is what we call secondary solidarity, and that is that even people who are willing for themselves to normalize platform work, nonetheless would stop and say, well, you know, I don't need protections, but I'm aware that other people who are full-time on this platform do need protections, and they should have more. So there's a broader kind of a penumbra of solidarity that might provide the potential for coalitional politics, if in fact it might develop. A second point that emerges in our study by way of conclusion is that the fact that gig workers tend to focus or to fixate on customers may be flipped around and have other sorts of consequences that might be more favorable to workers if they expose the unbalanced or pro-consumer design of most platforms. In other words, a demand for rectifying that imbalance. Although ultimately, it occurs to me that the worker-consumer alliance, ultimately, the relations between the two, if they can be pitted against one another, the possibility of expanding the rights of platform workers is minimal. If perhaps something broader, an equalization of risk and obligations and duties to each might be fostered, then perhaps a different path might open up. So that's pretty much what we have. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Okay, we can take 5 minutes for questions. Yes, Alex?
Hi, Steve. Alex Wood here. Great talk, fascinating research. It reminded me a bit of in the 1970s, Michael Mann wrote these great articles and books on class consciousness and pragmatic role acceptance, and basically argued that people had contradictory consciousness because the world is contradictory, and sometimes they feel, these workers, they might feel like entrepreneurs, and at other times they feel precarious, and that's like a rational position to have. And then people accept their role because realistically it's not very likely to actually change things, and it's better just to get on with your work, and then you have adaptive preference formation as well, that people probably don't want to think of themselves maybe as kind of suffering from these risks and want to avoid that cognitive dissonance. So I wondered whether, if the kind of the context changed where it was more possible to challenge the kind of status quo, do you think this normalization would reduce of the risks, and people might be more willing to support kind of mobilizations or other forms of resistance, or political parties that would change legal campaigns and things? If that makes sense.
I want to invite Julie to chime in if she would like to. But I suppose so. The literature that Alex is citing, it reminds me of, if Alex, you mean the ASR article by Michael Mann, the Social Cohesion of Liberal Democracy. It's really, I think, really important paper in terms of class consciousness, which is not a very well-developed literature of late, and we need those kinds of concepts. As I recall, Mann was particularly arguing that it's not so much the presence of a dominant ideology that it disempowers people, as might be the case with the embracers, for example, or the entrepreneurial types, so much as the blockage effect, that people are unable to formulate an alternative conception of what might be claimed. And I suppose that there is a fluidity here, and that's why we do speak about a potentially precarious or cracks in the edifice of the companies, in that collective action might mobilize, might begin to form kind of find support among people who are somewhat more privileged, but nonetheless sympathize with those who are less privileged. So the politics would be, the political coalition building might in fact lead in that direction, and we certainly hope that it does. The difficulty is that the apps themselves have confer structural power on the companies, because as Uber did in some of the struggles in New York City, they can actually deliver protesters to events defending the app. They can also hit this this button if you would like to send a letter to your congressman. They can mobilize the customer. So I think that is a chilling possibility. But yeah, certainly it would be possible for an alternative politics. I suppose that, you know, as companies begin to move toward IPOs, and as stock begins to kind of stock price begins to put investor pressure on apps to show greater profits, and then there's a squeeze, a lot of influences intersect and create possibilities, along with whatever kind of an economy we're facing these days, and who knows what we're in for. But yeah, I would think one would be hopeful, and I think that the literatures you're mentioning are well worth linking back to.
Can I just jump in? Yeah. So I agree that there's some scope for this, and certainly one of the things we've seen from the pandemic is how quickly people's expectations and demands can change. And there are definitely people in the sample who you sort of think, you know, they have a moral critique, but they just don't feel optimistic about the ability to actualize it. But in some ways, I think the more, you know, dominant interpretation is what Katie Wells and her colleagues are calling low expectations. They're writing about Uber in the context of urban politics, but I think one of the things that's happened in the United States is that workers have very low expectations of what they can get. So there's just a big hill to climb, I think, for that kind of class consciousness that you're talking about to be actualized. And sort of that's, you know, another way of saying that, you know, kind of reformulating the big finding of the paper, which is that the dominance of the normalization and the dominance of people just accepting these conditions, which, you know, in other contexts, and we can see in other places where there's a lot more resistance, people just do not think they should have to accept.
One more question by Valeria.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve, and also, of course, Juliet, fantastic paper. Yeah, in fact, linking to what Juliet now just said, I mean, I wanted to ask, particularly for these entrepreneurial sort of, or more the ones that you said, Steve, they are embracing the risk. Now, is there any evidence that at a certain point these people also get a bit, you know, disillusioned, and they start to really realize when they get on this platform that what they were expecting being entrepreneurs is not exactly what they see and they experience afterwards. So is there also some sort of, you know, kind of a movement in there? And another, what is not really a question, but more a comment, I found it quite very interesting, what you said about the instrumentalism related to the risk. And, you know, there, and when you said, okay, these people, just they said, well, we don't want minimum wages because we earn more. Now, what we see in our data, we see exactly these, what you say, but only in certain contexts, and then goes back to what Juliette was mentioning. For example, in Italy, where wages in labor market have been actually declining very much, people tend to prefer to work on platform and to, you know, kind of combining different jobs, simply because in labor market conditions are awful and people don't really get satisfaction. But in Belgium, it's completely different. As soon as people have the opportunity to exit the platform, they exit the platform. So, you know, these strategies in the European context get a little bit more kind of movement in the way in which, and what is interesting from an institutionalist point of view is that, in fact, institutions have been weakening, and we see also in Europe now, you know, well, certain countries still retaining possibilities, but in others not. So, you know, very interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
Julie will have much to say about this, but let me make 2 points. One thing is that we were really struck by how common it was among the embracers to have remarkably high levels of income over a period of time. And it's something we haven't really been able to explain. Is it human capital? Is it the sites kind of latch on to certain people who are reliable and kind of provide them with advantages and symbolic badges and honors that retain them and develop them into such high income earners? It's unclear. But so there wasn't a sense of being disillusioned. In other words, if you had engaged or embraced the platform work. The other point I want to make is that many of the people who are acceptors, and Julia, kind of jump in as you like, the interesting thing is that many of them had bureaucratic jobs that they found unfulfilling, and they enjoyed the flexibility of platform work. So one of them, for example, was a professional counselor in schools, and he enjoyed the flexibility of platform work and actually favored it because he didn't have to ask for days off. He didn't have to ask a boss for permission to take vacation. So the contrast between the bureaucratic employment that they find that they chafed at, and the apparent freedom kind of heightened their sense of autonomy in ways that were built in. Now, it is, of course, the case that the labor market and possibilities kind of govern what's legitimate to think in various ways. And but that's what we found in the US anyway, Valeria.
So if I could just say one thing. On your first point, I think it's hard to say because we don't have a longitudinal, and not that many people talked about, I mean, there was some talk about how people's views changed over time, and there are not that many embracers, so it's a little bit hard to say. On the second point, I just want to make a point about the literature more generally as it relates to what you say. And this relates a little bit to Timothy, I think, his initial critique of the literature. Because a lot of it was coming from sociology and geography, I think it lacked enough of a analysis of people as kind of economically rational agents, and which I think a lot of these workers are, not all of them. I mean, I've done some, you know, we have a paper on that, and because we don't have good data and sort of studies from inside the firms, so it's really hard to understand what the firms are up to in terms of the labor market dynamics that they're responding to. So Valeria, I really agree with your point, which is that, you know, we need to think about sort of the local economics of these markets and how that's key to understanding what people are doing. It's a really big part of what's going on. And this relates to Timothy's point also, like the basic supply and demand conditions in these markets, because we have such a poor understanding of what those supply and demand curves look like, you know, and sort of what the firms are doing in response to that. It's just really hard to understand what's going on.
Thank you very much. So, our next presenter is Cynthia Srnec from Sciences Po.
It's okay for everybody. Do I need to share, I think, right? Oh no, it's okay. Thank you. I don't know if people are on Zoom, they are seeing my screen. It's okay? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to present these papers about France. I'm from a sociologist from Argentina, working in Sciences Po Paris. And this paper, it was a project with Institut Mines Telecom with my colleague Cédric Gossard. And it's a very curious project because we did it associated to the biggest non-for-profit health insurance of France, that is La Mutuelle MGN. So we kind of negotiate this field of research about social protection in the sharing economy, and we propose to do it about riders.
And we start to do it in March of 2020. So we did all the field work during the pandemic crisis. So today I'm just going to pass very quickly about the introduction and questions, because we all know about these platform works issues. And I'm going to show you two main results, some concluding remarks. This is still a work that we are still analyzing, because we need to recode and to do more statistical tests. So we are all aware of the social problem about the precarity in the platform work. We are here focusing on riders. There are new regulations, especially in Europe and in France. They are also right now, I don't know if you are all aware of this, but there is, in France, they try to create a negotiation between platforms and independent riders. So this is completely new, and we are also following this for another project. And there is the proposal of the European Union about that most platform workers can be considered as employees. So all this is also changing some of the discourses among riders. The main references that inspires this work are the work of Robert Castell on the rise of uncertainties, disaffiliation, insecure work, vulnerable relationships. And there are some also references in France about social protection in France. Why I'm highlighting this? Because in France we are supposed to have an universal social protection system. So some of my French colleagues saying, we don't need to ask the question if you are covered or not, because we are all covered. Well, we'll see that. So the key questions of these papers are, what are the social protection needs of the riders? Who and how is covered by the social security system? And what are the most vulnerable profile of workers? So our research design, as I said, we built an online survey. We released it online on December 2020. We had several channels of diffusion, like Facebook groups of riders, also in manifestation, and we also talked to some trade unions. We got 236 answers. It's not bad. We are very happy about this. So we can have some correspondence analysis of these results. And then we did, in fact, more than 18 interviews. I did also ethnographic interviews, and I did some ethnographic observations in gathering of riders, trade unions, and manifestations in 3 big cities of France. So this slide is about the global online survey. So riders in France, they are mostly young. They have less 30 years or less. They are mainly men. This is their most recent and only job. I mean, they don't have another source of income. Previous experiences, we have 3 groups: students, job seekers or inactives, and employees that they have an extra income. The motivations, as we have seen in the literature, is material reasons, and also this desire of autonomy and flexible working hours. About the status, 98% are self-contractors, 67% receive revenue from the platforms that are under the minimum wage in France, and they work more than 20 hours, most of them. So it is a dangerous work. Our survey shows that the global population of riders, 51% suffer accidents or aggressions during their work as riders, 69% suffer of fatigue, stress, disease. And we can see some differences, some social differences, if we cross with professional background groups. Because we asked the question, what were your status before starting being a rider? So that's how we separate these groups in students and employees or inactive, and then employees or actives also as self-contractors in another activity. So you can see that the group, the unemployed and inactive is this one. They suffer more aggressions or the accidents here or ADCs than the other 2 groups. Okay, so I will continue with this. So with all the questions, we have confirmed that there is a huge social security gap, and it crosses social inequalities that are present in the society. Because if we consider all the population that answered to our survey, 31.5% may not be covered by the social security French system, because 11% declare not to be covered and 20% that they don't know it at all. So we need to consider that, of course, we have a migrant population, but because of our protocol of RGPD research, we couldn't really ask the origin of people. So, but of course, we can have the perceptions and the intuition of a lot of activists that talk to us. And so we know that a large proportion of the people that are not covered, they have migrant origins. So here you can see this social inequality, because there are unemployed and inactive that, if we count this, it makes it 52% of people that are not covered. And it's completely the opposite situation than students or employees, because they have, of course, a formal job. So there is also what we discovered, and this was a finding that we were not expected to do, a political and social problem, because there is a lack. So there is a lack of knowledge. I asked them, okay.
I will start over.
There is a lack of knowledge about social rights. And this is very important. And this is something that I have seen in this conference. And we need to consider the historical, social, and national context of every country, but also of the origins of the writers. Because most of the population that I interview, they are young, this is their very first job. They don't know about really workers' rights or social rights. They don't know if they are covered or not, because maybe they're just students and their parents have done all the paperwork for them. So this is very important, and it is also, I think, a function, and I'm just making some conclusions right now, but this is also a very important role to the trade unions to work on this. So I will pass. So we asked writers if they have an accident or if they were sick, and what happened. So 61% that they have an accident, they didn't inform the company. Why? Because they were afraid of being disconnected. And then the people that they inform, 26%, they didn't receive any help. And then it was just 30% that received financial support, at 7% kind of psychological of moral support. So most of them, they say, in fact, it doesn't really, how to say, worth all the time consuming declaring this, because we don't get much. So, and this leads us to, this is the typology that I want to show you about the different degrees of vulnerability of our writers. So we have 4 profiles considering risk exposure, but it's risk to the health or physical or psychological health of the writer, to accidents, illness, aggressions. And then the other variable that you can see is the social security protections in a large perspective. So you can see that profile 1 is they are the highest vulnerable writers, and profile 4 they are the most covered writers, so one that are less vulnerable. So I'm going to pass to this. So the first profile, the serious vulnerability, they are exposed to more risk, but they got the less protection. So they are full-time writers because they are self-contractors, paid by order, so they suffer of this time pressure that we all know. The background, most of them are unemployed or they were inactive and they have migration origins. They are long-term writers. They work for more than 2 years. And this is a big difference with the other profiles. And they also plan to continue to be writers. So they are platform economic dependents, and they are affected by the reduction of fares, because every summer, at least in France, some big platform used to reduce the fares that they pay to riders, so they are forced to work more hours to make the same revenues. So if we pass, I think to the right for me, I don't know, for you go left, to profile 2, we have the moderate vulnerability. They also have high risks, but they have a higher social protections because I think here the difference is, we can say maybe class status, because it's involved that they are students, so they have health insurance because they are students in France, and also they have access to their family resources, so they can have family social security protection because they are married or they are in couple, or because of their parents, or they have an independent insurance because they have also another source of income. So these people, even though if they are high exposed, they have sort of a way also to go out and to decide if they want to stop. Profile 3 and profile 4. Profile 3, I'm going to explain it very quick. They have low vulnerability, even though they have social protection, low social protection, they are seasonal workers. They are short-term riders. They are not platform economic dependent. Here we have, for example, some employees or students that just work for a very few time to earn extra money for holidays. So even though if they don't benefit from a large specific social protection, because I mean, here we also need to think that there is a difference if you are an employee and you have a health insurance that is adapted to the activity of rider. It's not the same as having a plain basic social protection insurance. So this leads us to the profile 4, the cover vulnerability. They are less exposed to risk and they have the higher social protection. Why is that? Because I have 2 examples. I have people working for cooperatives in France. So they have a formal job with a permanent contract with social security coverage. They have professional training. They can develop a career. They have a fair income, rights at work, and they receive adequate equipment and maintenance. So this is also part of fair and just working conditions that reduces their risk. And because most of these cooperatives, they don't work on the food tech, they don't have time pressure, because also the what they call the shift and the rounds for doing delivering, they are really planned and they don't need to rush because they don't work on last minute demand. So this is a huge difference from, for example, the other, I'm going to try this, the other profile that is also covered, but is also vulnerable, that is employees of delivery platforms. We are thinking about the case of Just Eat Takeaway that also offers permanent contract, but they pay minimum wage, it's already paid. There are not a lot of expectation of a professional career. So trade unions in France are fighting for better conditions, and they are not fully covered in the case of accidents because they don't have a collective agreement that applies as couriers, so they don't have a health insurance that will cover them in case of big accidents, and they don't receive any equipment supply, so that also affects them in kind of accident. For example, if they have an accident and its bike broke, they don't have a bike of replacement. So we can say that they are in a low-cost employment condition, but in general terms, they are still in the most covered profile. So I think I speed up so I can read my conclusions, and I have more data if you want. So platforms escape sectoral labor regulations to a large extent. On the one hand, the self-employee status is mostly imposed by the platform. So even if it corresponds to an ideal of flexibility and autonomy, in practice, it favors precariousness and reinforces social inequalities. Riders are subject to difficult working conditions imposed by the platforms. Individual health insurance services and self-employed social security exhaust the liberalization of the market and the weakening of the social protection of the workforce. On the other hand, the employee status offered by some platforms reproduces a low-quality social protection and work conditions. There is always a minimum of vulnerability since the food tech delivery work is exposed to inevitable accidents. A qualitative different case is proposed by the worker cooperative because they don't have the same business models. So what we also find out with this survey in particular is that there is a segmentation of the precarious situation lived by subgroups of riders that it rests on the worker status and the quality of the contract offered by the company, and this is one-side decision. It is multiplied or mitigated by social inequalities based on the disparity of personal resources and professional backgrounds. So the public security system is seen as a safety net, but in fact it's not universal in practice. So the support offered by the companies is not permanent and also is not grounded on regulation. So therefore, there is not any new solution to better protect riders because their job precariousness implies social and economic inequalities. So thank you for your attention. I'm sorry if I rushed a lot.
So we may take a few minutes for questions.
But there is another session in 2 minutes. So
In 2 minutes? Oh no, it's not
this
fair.
is why they are a
Not
bit
fair,
stressed, I
no,
think.
not fair.
It's not fair.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we discussed this.
Shut the door.
Oh, wait. Society. So I am expert in RGPD right now, but no. But then I have interviews. So this is cool. So in my paper that we analyzing, we can say like complete the puzzle with this.
Okay, one last question, and then we're ready to ask you.
Yeah, we can
I'm
ask
sorry,
you
I've been a
without
very
any
bad
tension.
time.
It's just a comment, and I want to say that I think one of the most important findings that we also stressed is that quite some gig workers are not aware of their precariousness. So I'm looking at different type of people. I'm more looking at the high-skilled online gig workers, and also there, they don't perceive it as an issue that they're not secured and insured and whatnot. But of course, it depends also on the country. When you look at France, it is an issue. When you look at Pakistan, hey, they're still better off having a job than not having a job because they're always not insured. So I think the two comments I want to make, I think it's super important to highlight this fact of not being aware. And second, it's a very country dependent. It's a comment.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.